Welcome back, everyone. We'll start in another few seconds. And I will do a short introduction and then turn it over to Major Ethan Frizzell, who's with the Salvation Army. Just a second. So I'll turn it over to Major Ethan Frizzell of the Salvation Army, who also is a consultant to the Housing Center and was instrumental in helping design this toolkit, the Neighbors Toolkit, which is all about displacement, homeless displacement, and the rate of displacement, and housing pressure that we talked about earlier this morning. So we got into this. We've been focused on housing supply for quite some time. And been focused on housing supply for quite some time. We've been doing a lot of research on that, and that's why we developed the HEAT Toolkit originally. And then last year, we had a series of convenings in September of last year in California. And Ethan was part of that in 3 of the cities, Southern California. And as a result, we started connecting, and there's been a lot of research that's come out recently, books, articles, and our own research, connecting the issue of homelessness, the rate of homelessness, with lack of housing supply, lack of abundant housing. And so we started looking at that question. As I said, Ethan's been a catalyst in this, looking at that question, and ultimately we looked at 54 different metrics that could help explain variation in the displacement rate across metros, or COCs as they're called. So we're going to be shifting from terminology like counties and metros to things called COCs. A COC is a continuum of concern, or excuse me, continuum of care. And that's a geographic grouping, largely of counties, that's created by HUD. And there's nearly 400 of them around the country. And that's how a lot of the data is tracked in the homeless area. So we're using, as you'll see, we're using that particular geography. So 90% of the time we'll be talking about COCs, 10% of the time we'll be at a metro level or some other level, because that's the level the data are at. And so we started looking at that for these 64 different metrics, and we found that we didn't have sort of an anticipation of what the answer was, but we found that the metric that had the greatest explanatory power was the relationship between median home price and median income. And that even exceeded things like rent and all the other factors that we looked at. And if you want to sort of think about why that's the case, you can use an example that the Sightline, I think a group out of Northwest West Coast of the US, Oregon and Washington, uses, which is musical chairs. If you think of it as a game of musical chairs, and you start with 100 people who want a house, and there are only 90 houses, and you sort of go through the game, sort of 10 chairs at a time, and you'll see that when you have 100 people with 90 houses and you sell the top 10 houses, that the people in those 100 who can pay the most for the houses are going to get the chairs. And then as you move down to the 80th to 90th chair, 81st to 90th chair on down, each time the people are going to get the chairs that can afford chairs. Eventually, if you're in a place like California, you're going to run out of owner-occupied housing, and you're going to have to go into rental housing. How do we know that? Well, California has a pretty low owner-occupied rate compared to the rest of the country. And so the number of owner-occupied chairs is less, even though there's a shortage of chairs, there's also a shortage of owner-occupied chairs. And so you now have people that would want to get an owner-occupied house, but there aren't enough chairs for them, even at their income. And so they have to opt out for rental. So now they're putting, because there weren't enough chairs, they're first putting pressure on home prices relative to incomes. That's driving up home prices. Now some of the people that aren't able to get owner-occupied chairs are now moving into the rental area, and they're starting to push rents up and take rental units away from people that normally would be renting and not necessarily be able to afford an owner-occupied house. That process continues until you get down to you run out of chairs, and at that point, the 10 people who are left have a couple of choices. They and this is a stylized way to think about it. They can move in with their parents. We know that California, that's very prevalent. They can move in with friends. They can double up. They can couch surf if they really come, let's say they lose a job or they have some other issue, domestic violence, whatever. And so they move in with friends, couch surf, they move into their car, and ultimately they can move out onto the street or into a shelter. And as Ethan's going to explain, we can show that relationship across these continua of care and the levels that we see across the country. So hopefully that helps sort of put this in context and why the price of single family homes relative to income is the best explanatory factor in terms of what explains the variability across these 360 or so continuum of care. With that, I'll turn it over to Major Ethan Frizzell.
Thank you, Ed. It's always a pleasure to join you and AEI for these important conversations. I look forward to today talking about the Good Neighbors Index and how it's been developed and how we're using it to change the narrative in the homeless service sector across the country. A couple of housekeeping tools as we do is I'll share my screen. First, we recognize the goals of American Enterprise Institute Housing Center. We appreciate it greatly, providing transparent and objective mortgage housing market trends at unprecedented levels of detail, fostering a stable system of mortgage finance that promotes sustainable ownership, and developing market-based solution to the nation's shortage of economic housing. How I come into this conversation is through the Salvation Army. And as part of the Salvation Army, as I speak today, I don't speak for the organization at a national level, territorial level, or divisional level. The views expressed are my own after 25 years of experience, research, and innovation. But I'm glad to answer questions as I can from that experience and appreciate your participation today, as the Salvation Army has been using the Good Neighbors Index in multiple communities to bring forth a case of support for changes in how we not only speak about those suffering from housing pressure, but also as we design solutions. This conversation started, as Ed mentioned, in previous conversations when we've been in different cities, and there's this argument between not in my backyard. Others are yes in my backyard. You're familiar with NIMBY, you're familiar with YIMBY, and recognizing that the majority of people that we serve are actually from the communities where they live. And so often people are speaking about their neighbors in ways as if they're not from the communities or not from their states. And what we find is the majority of people who are in need of housing are actually in that community. So part of our goal in the Good Neighbors Index was to change the conversation, because we know that when you discuss homelessness, whether it be a Chamber of Commerce or economic development, that often we get pushed to the side because it's one that people find this difficult to deal with, and or there's fatalism. They don't think they can make a difference. So with the help of and leadership of American Enterprise Institute Housing Center, AEI, we came up with a Good Neighbors Index, recognizing and celebrating that the people we are referring to are indeed our neighbors, and that a good neighbors approach helps our neighbors get housed as quickly as possible. First, we recognize that the problem is an attribution problem. Albert Einstein said we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. As many of you have heard this morning, some of the problems that we're dealing with in housing pressure actually started near the turn of the century. That'd be 1922, and have been designed to create the housing pressure that we experience today. And so some of those problems often are being reviewed by the same thinking that created them. And the Good Neighbors Index causes us to look at it differently and discuss it with data information. I also prefer a quote from Edward Deming that says, "Every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it does." We recognize that the systems in communities, continuum of care and throughput systems, are designed for the results they get. So as we visit with cities, we are able to say, are you pleased with the current experience that you have for those who are not housed, for your neighbors in need? And if you are pleased, then we don't have to interrupt. But what we find is that most communities that are calling upon us, and I know that I've done 40 cities reports, but most of the communities that are calling upon us are not pleased with the results they're getting, and they want additional information. And so we recognize that often it's an attribution problem, blaming the person instead of recognizing that actually it's usually involves the system or the city itself. Next, we recognize a great article from Jerusalem that was in The Atlantic in November 2022, and we recommend you take a look at it. It's the idea that housing breaks people's brains. For some reason, the idea of giving free market to housing is hard for people to understand. There's a general sense of understanding that for some reason, if you allow more housing, it will increase prices. But what we know is that by reducing housing pressure, as Ed stated before, we actually then reduce other pressures like rental pressures, even transportation pressures. And so by allowing the market to create housing solutions, we end up with lower pressure. I came across this first in experience when I had the privilege of leading the Salvation Army's response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. We recognized that there was no government fix for the housing crisis in New Orleans, and even with the massive amounts of money that was there, the only solution that we could see was those communities that had multiple builders providing multiple choices so that people could maximize their housing options on land that they owned. That there was no government size fix and there was even no nonprofit size fix, but that we had to support the local communities, the local neighborhoods, and the local solutions in order to maximize housing options. Even at that time in 2011, that was breaking people's brains because sometimes we feel like we have to tell people what to do when really the option is to let them be creative in determining their own uses for property they own and their own housing solutions. Finally, to quote my friend Edward Pinto, keep it simple, stupid. Sometimes it's just recognizing that light touch density is the most effective and politically palatable way to solve our housing crisis. And that's a quote from an opinion piece that was ran nationally recently from Ed, and we appreciate that. The Ed and the AEI team with Tobias and Arthur have been proponents of allowing people to use their property rights, and their property values in order to maximize housing that's available in solutions. So Edward, I had to quote you as well. Keep it simple, stupid. And friends, as I share this today, believe it or not, this is our effort at keeping it simple. Enough data to be well informed, enough data to make good policy, but simple enough that it can be received and be used for policymakers and in the public sector, nonprofit sector, and private sector to bring forth best solutions. So part of what we did with Good Neighbors, and I'll only take a minute to share it, is we worked on reframing communication. Part of Good Neighbors is using housing data to reframe the conversation in the homeless service sector. By focusing on housing data, it has opened up lines of communications around the nation that we have struggled to get into before. And in this conversation, in this reframing, we're able to talk about housing, housing, and housing. Part of reframing is choosing a value to define our impact goals. Values help us to establish a collective orientation, contextualize thinking, and tap emotions that work for policy thinking. Part of the Good Neighbors language came because we recognize that in the faith-based movements, that there's a call to love your neighbor, serve your neighbor, help your neighbor, care for your neighbor. And so the idea of good neighbors language calls upon that value of one neighbor to the other. And most of us can appreciate when a neighbor has been kind to us before and are privileged to be kind to others. Finally, we recognize that part of reframing communication is to not repeat what you want people to forget. So you will hear in the Good Neighbors Index and in the tools that we do not use the term homeless. We don't talk about the homeless. You might hear us refer to the homeless sector, but we recognize that it's housing pressure that increases those who experience homelessness, and we tend to use it only as a data subset because the Continuum of Care and the annual homeless report use the term homeless, and so we have to use it there. But as a matter of solution in reframing, we do not rarely use the term homeless, because our goal is to make sure that all of our neighbors have quality housing. Also, repeat what you want people to remember. And so if you take something away from our time this afternoon, I hope you might repeat that naturally affordable housing reduces housing pressure. Housing pressure increases housing displacement, and good neighbors focus on neighborhood reentry, making sure that all neighbors have the opportunity for housing. So naturally affordable housing brought by light touch density reduces housing pressure. Housing pressure, when increased, increases housing displacement, but good neighbors focus on neighborhood reentry and reducing housing pressure. You notice what I did there? I just repeated it 3 times. So in a word, it's efficacy. If efficacy is the idea that you're able to do that which you say, when you have large conversations only around homeless projects, homeless sector, homeless problems, it creates high urgency, but low efficacy. There's not a belief you can do anything about it. And then people respond with fatalism. There's just simply nothing we can do about it. But if there's low urgency and high efficacy, there's low motivation. It's we don't need to do anything about it. We don't have a problem. And there's areas in the country that have very low rates of housing displacement. But the magic is when there's high urgency and high efficacy, which says that we are clear that we are at a point of concern, and we're clear that there's a way to walk through those concerns with proper policy that can make it so our neighbors can be housed. This was a significant part of our conversation when we were developing Good Neighbors. The question is if we can provide data on a quarterly basis to communities that shows the risk of housing pressure and housing displacement, then should we do that before a community crashes their system with those who no longer have housing? And we'll look at that in a moment. But in a word, efficacy. We're hoping to create high urgency with high efficacy, meaning there is a problem and we know how to deal with it. So there's the question of if there's capacity for producing a desired result or effect. When you repeat the problem, you reduce efficacy expectations. But when we repeat the solution, you increase efficacy expectations. Meaning when we talk about good neighbors, using light touch density to create housing options, reducing housing pressure, we have less neighbors displaced from housing. By stating that over and over in communities, we see that communities believe that they can achieve what their goal is, and we see faster results. There's 5 elements of a well-framed solution. So they have to be concrete, collective, conceivable, credible, and causal. And we hope today with what we share that you see that we have achieved these goals, that they're concrete, collective, conceivable, credible, and causal. Many of you would have heard this morning's sessions, the summary of lessons that were learned. I share them here only to get us in the same direction, and then we'll go right into the tool. One, we realized that light touch density housing, both naturally affordable and inclusionary, was banned through single-family detached zoning policies beginning in 1922. We recognize that NIMBY arose in 1950s and just grew through the 70s. And even now, just down the street, I'm in Southwest Florida, those who were concerned about housing actually stopped a project last week where the rents would have been $2,300 a month per unit, for they found that it might bring people who are undesirable to their community. We recognize that traditional affordable housing programs fail because they ignore the fact that the constraints are created by zoning and land use regulations. We recognize that single room occupancy units were effective, but pretty much have been regulated out of existence. We recognize that less and less lower priced land at density of 15 to 30 units per acre is zoned for model priced apartments. We recognize that filtering down is a key market force to assure affordability. And if you didn't get a chance this morning to see AEI's heat index and the experience of filtering, AEI has done some of the most significant filtering research in recent history to show what that looks like across the market. Exclusionary zoning and NIMBYism have led to homes becoming increasingly unaffordable, but we hope that the Good Neighbors Index, which shows median home price to median income ratio, is highly correlated to the homelessness count or the displacement rate within communities. So we are going to get to that. But before we do, one last piece. One of the reasons we did this is we recognize that mayors believe they're held accountable for addressing homelessness, but have little control. Almost 3/4 of mayors, 73%, believe that they have responsibility by residents for local homelessness, yet only 19% believe that they have any control in their city. What's happened is that we've created a space where people are able to blamescape and not create solutions. But what we know is that zoning and land use regulations are actually the key indicator of what allows for people to be housed. The American Enterprise Institute Housing Center's Good Neighbor Index provides us the comparative measurements and rankings to advance the process of gaining controls. And what our key insight is that the ratio of median home price to median income is the primary indicator of the rate of housing displacement in the future. So what we recognize is mayors need effective foresights, local forecasting with real information, and the courage to disturb the present with neighboring, abundant housing, and rehousing systems. And so with that, we will go to the index. As we look at the index, we will recognize that you can find the index at AEI Housing Center, Good Neighbors Toolkit. If you Google it, thankfully, it pops right up very quickly. Today, we will be looking at the tool as a whole. We'll be looking at the GNI COC print report. And then I would like to mention that there are presentations that are available that are both taped and live, like this one, and slide decks that are available that are easy to use for your benefit in your community. And finally, the appendix has additional tools. But if we start with the index, we start with a call for us to choose what data that we want. So the index has on it the instructions for use. Tools 2, 3, and 4, which you'll see in a moment, allow a single COC to be selected. Tools 4 and 12 through 16 allow for multiple tools to be selected. If you look at the right, you'll see a GNI tool glossary. GNI means Good Neighbors Index. You'll see GNI metrics, GNI maps, displacement rates, and then metrics per year. For those of us who've now been doing this for 9 months, we use this language as everyday language, and we are finding more and more cities are too, as they're using the data, and we're pleased to do that. The default state selected is Texas and the COC is Houston, and that's because Houston zoning has been so appropriate to their housing needs and have really become a national leader in services. I'm pleased to know also that in Houston, the Salvation Army uses life navigation as part of their process, helping those who get pushed and pressured out of housing back into housing. And so for today's conversation, we are going to use not only Houston, but we're going to use LA. In knowing this, once you get comfortable with your continuum of care number, it's actually quite easy to find. I know that LA is CA 99. It is a combined COC because there's multiple COCs in that region. And what you'll see is that as my wheel is turning, once we select that, then it is getting other reports ready for us. As a standard, we review multiple cities. Denver, Houston, and Los Angeles are our standard ones. And those are because the three of those tell stories, and we have interest in those as we are helping them through some projects. After you put in the instruction page, the first tool is the Good Neighbors Index COC map by year. Which pulls up a map of the COCs, as Edward mentioned previously in the COCs. I'm sorry about that. In the COCs, as you look around the country, there's 238 COCs that provide 1-year data, and then there's a total of 363 COCs that provide 5 years data. Now, someone who's watching is saying, why is it 234 to 238 or 363 and 369? The reason that is that from 2007 until now, the HUD has combined some continuum of care. And I'm thankful to say that AEI went through very careful analysis in order to combine data where necessary, but there are 4 or 5 COCs that have been combined over time, and because that's true, then their information changes. So all the large COCs, there's roughly 235, and of the entirety of COCs, there's roughly 365. On the map, what you're able to do is you can select the year over to the right, from 2012 to 2013. We like to use 2019 a good bit because it was pre-pandemic. It will show what the rates were that year, and then in it will show displacement rates and displacement pressure, as you can see on the right. You can choose and search for either natural displacement, which we'll describe in a moment, serious displacement, extreme displacement, or you can look at displacement pressure. If you want to see the larger COCs or 1-year view, it's ACS1, that's the American Survey. If you want to see all of the smaller ones, then we would, and their information, then we would hit the A5, and you can see that changes the map and what you're able to see. So you see when you hit 5, the rest of the country comes in, because a lot of those areas that are smaller areas, we only are able to get their data every 5 years by census. But you will also know that most of those small areas are a green, which would say that they're experiencing more of a natural rate of displacement, which, like natural rates of unemployment, there are those who will be displaced because of social issues or other issues, but they're often not because of housing pressure first. And so in that, again, on the right, you can change the year. So there's 2015. And if you'd like to, you can highlight. So we know that LA is 999. Which when I do that, you know, LA, Atlanta, Chicago, and Detroit are all 999. Those are some of the larger cities. And if you look at the map, it now has highlighted those. So you see that highlighted is LA, which has a hover over with their data, which we'll review in a moment. We'll see Chicago, Atlanta, and Detroit, all 999s, which tends to be a large, the larger COCs, but that allows you to do it. I happen to be in the 603 in Fort Myers, Florida, so I can pull up that and you will see that there's Fort Myers and there's other 603s around the country. But once you know your COC number, it's very easy just to plug in the number as I just did, pull up your information and move from one map to the other. The next tool that we look at is the powerhouse of the system. This is a tool, and I give tremendous credit and appreciation, as I'm sure you will, to Edward and Tobias and Arthur, who worked together to scattergraph 10 years of data for 369 communities based on housing pressure, displacement rates, and then mapped them out to see the correlation, which we'll look at in a moment. And so as we look at this, what we will see on the y-axis is we see on the y-axis the 2019 displacement rate. That would be the point in time homelessness count per 1,000 people. What we would see on the x-axis is the displacement pressure. That's median price to median total income. And so through the Good Neighbors Index, we talk about two things. We talk about displacement rates, and we talk about displacement pressure. Each dot that you see on the map is a different community. You will note that communities with housing pressure or displacement pressure less than 3 tend to have natural rates of displacement, whereas communities with higher pressure have higher rates of displacement. We notice that there's a few lines that become very important. Some of these lines have been seen before in previous research. We were pleased that when we did this research, it agreed with that. But you'll notice that the 5-point line is a line that all of a sudden has the greatest inference in change of trajectory in the displacement rate. And so when a community moves towards 5.0 housing pressure, we know that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the system. You're going to note that LA to the right is at 8.5. You would note that New York City is 8.7, displacement pressure is 9.8. San Francisco is 9.3. So we're pleased to note that what we see in experience actually matches what the data shows, because it would be problematic if it didn't. We recognize that we have outliers like Humboldt County in Northern California, where you have extreme pressure and very high rates of displacement. And then we have other outliers like Daly San Mateo County, which is down by Pebble Beach, where you have high pressure, but different rates. And so then we start looking at system issues. When is a city a good actor, bad actor? When is a community having a strong system or a weak system? And so we were able to create, and when I say we, again, it was AEI, Tobias and Arthur and the team created a standard line, a trend line, and a standard line of deviation. And the standard line of deviation says, is this area behaving in a way that we would expect them to behave? Are they experiencing a rate of displacement like we're expecting? Or are they behaving better than we would expect? And of course, just like any line of standard deviation, you would see the majority behave the way that we expect, but there are those who are not. Now, by now, someone is saying, oh, but you're using the point in time in homelessness, and we don't believe that's accurate. We understand that the point in time has some inaccuracies. However, for the benefit of policy, another counterpart at AEI did a study last year. Kevin Corinth did a study that did a review of census data with point in time and concluded in a paper that's available to you that point in time is the most accurate tool we have for policy and a right and reasonable tool as we use policies for good neighbors. So my encouragement to the practitioners is do not confuse your market on point in time by your concerns with it, but instead use the information that you're gathering to make the point that you want, increasing efficacy and increasing effectiveness as a whole. As we look to the right of the tool, you'll see that you can check for population if you want. So if you are in a smaller community and you want to look at communities like yours, then you can change it and it will take away those communities that are larger. This gives you an opportunity. How cool is that, right? This gives you an opportunity to look at communities that are like yours. So if I were to, again, there's Los Angeles is already highlighted. If I were to put in the 603 where I am, I could do that. And it'll change that highlight. So here's Fort Myers way down here, 4.0. But again, if we look, be mindful that this is 2019. We use 2019 as the example to learn from, as it was the last standard one before 2022. So we'll get there in one moment. So in 2019, Fort Myers was below 4.0 pressure. I'm sorry to say that today we're at 5.1 and we're feeling it, but we'll look at that in a moment. On the other side, what we see is that if you have a larger community, you can do the same thing and search for communities that are closer to your size. So you could see that by doing that, I pick up Phoenix, I pick up Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Georgia. And this gives you an opportunity to look and see how people are behaving that are the same size that you are, how their systems are behaving and how they're responding. And then it also allows us to look at outliers like in New York City and the unfortunate challenges that are there because of housing pressure. And so this is a tool that we use as a standard to explain the COC scatter plot because we're comfortable that up to 2019, the data was running somewhat more like previous years, whereas with the pandemic, we had some challenges. Yeah, so Anna asked, which I'd be glad to do that. Anna asked that every 5 years is the next one in 2024, and I would ask one of our data specialists when the next 5-year report is. If the last one was in 2019, then it would be in 2024, but I'll ask them to confirm that. Thank you, Anna.
We'll get you an answer to that shortly.
Thank you.
The 5-year is when we say 2019, the ACS is the American Community Survey, and they do, I forget it, I think it's a 1% sample every year. So you can imagine if you're in a smaller place, a 1% sample of a smaller place is a small, relatively speaking, sample. And so in the smaller places, we aggregate 5 years worth of data, which 2019 is the midpoint. So it's 2017, 18, 19, 20, and 21 data, which we call 2019. We're using that, for the population calculation, and we're using the COC, we're using the point in time from 2019, because in order to calculate both a rate and of displacement rate and a displacement pressure, we have numerators and denominators, and that denominator has in it population is part of it and sales price is part of it, and those we get from the American Community Survey. So that's a 5-year rolling 5 years. We call it 2019. So I think the next one is 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22, which then becomes 2020. But we have some problems with 2020 because 2020 was right in the middle of the pandemic. And so we're still wrestling with that. When we go to the 1 year, which again, it's a 1% sample, but when you're dealing with large COCs, a 1% sample is a lot larger than for the smaller COCs. And therefore, we can use the 1% sample, it's large enough. And that gives, and so that we're using for 2022. The ACS numbers come out in, I think, July or August of each year. And so that's when we can get the 2022 number. The point in time number for 2022 came out in December of last year. And the next number that's going to be coming out will be in December of this year for 2023. That was a lot I just went through, but again, that's explaining why we have this 5-year period and this 1-year period. Back to you, Ethan.
Yes, and friends, that's why we make good friends with people at American Enterprise Institute, because I learned a new term called periodicity, which just means that thankfully they get data as soon as it's available. So for the 2022 data, for example, it became available in September and our reports were updated by November, things that are a massive amount of work in order to align them with COCs, the things that we give AEI great thanks for. So to continue that, as we look at the scatter plot, you'll see that this tool, which are all numbered on the tools, is GNI metric COC scatter plot by year. This is a very powerful tool if you have leadership responsibility in your communities, because you can go to a COC in the year and you can watch how that works. So if you look in 2012 to watch Los Angeles, you'll see that Los Angeles had a housing pressure of 7.5. And again, I can hover and I can get the details. It had a housing pressure of 7.5, meaning it took 7.5 years of the median income to buy the median home. Then at that time, the displacement rate per 1,000 is 3.6. So 3.6 people per 1,000 people experienced displacement and or homelessness in their community. Both of those were rated as severe and then extreme. If we watch Los Angeles, and if you look at 2012, we can show that in 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. And so you can look at years, and then if you'd like to, you can find communities as we did before that are closer to the size of Los Angeles, just like that. And then you're welcome to see what other communities and how they behave during those years. And what this does is it makes sure that when we're looking at communities, that we're able to say this community either has good housing policies for everyone, or they have housing policies that's creating great pressure. It also allows us, when we look at those closely, to see communities that are all of a sudden having a problem that they haven't had such a problem before. And again, this 5.0 mark and this 4.0 mark become tremendously important because we know that systems tend to start crashing after 5.0. So you may or may not be surprised that Seattle is there. You see LA. You see that their rates are close to the same, even though their pressures are different. And that's when we start looking at cultures and systems and other approaches of how things are done. And so if we continue to watch those, there's 2016, there's 2018, there's Seattle, there's Los Angeles. If you remember the news and what's happening, we saw this happen. We know what this looked like. Let's see who crossed 5.0. Las Vegas, that would not surprise us. And then we see who is back here, which is places like Chicago, and then those who are coming up, Miami-Dade and Santa Ana. And then we might say in Miami-Dade, why is Miami-Dade behaving well? And that's where the Salvation Army has the privilege of calling over to our Salvation Army counterparts, which they report that Miami has one of the tightest systems in the country, and that's how they keep their rates so low compared to many systems with like pressure. And so you can adjust these the way that you want to on population. It's actually, be careful once you see it. It's hard not to see. It becomes fun to play with, but it becomes useful because you become a data advocate. And you can start replacing anecdotes with data, but then use anecdotes to tell data versus things that are less informed. And so this is GNI metrics. It's number 3 on the toolkit. Is scatter plot by year. Again, you can use the 1 year, you can use the 5 year, and when you use the 5 year, we tend to be moving towards more small populations. And you can see what that looks like. But in the same way that we use the big cities, you can focus in on the small cities. And then I'm going to show you a trick in a moment. Because all the data is still sitting there, you can actually hold your mouse, highlight an area, and look at those that compare around you. And AEI very graciously left that data available to us, which means that once you found your city, you can actually table that data, move it into a data window, and look at those cities that are comparison to you and how they did with time. So I'm going to pause on that for a moment, but it's kind of an insider trick that I use a lot. When people say, what do you think is going to happen in my city? I'm able to say, well, let's see what happened to those cities around you. Let's look at the AEI housing forecasts, and we can look and see what that is. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's a little tip and trick that's in the back scenes. Then if we look at 4, we're getting to a lot of to the powerhouse of what I showed you before. This graphic is a lot of dots. The reason why it's important is this is the data from 2012 to 2022. It's 10 years. You'll see in the highlight, you can see that we highlighted Los Angeles in this case. And so whereas before I showed you 1 year at a time, this one shows you all 10 years and how Los Angeles has moved from 7.5 to 10. So that Los Angeles has continued to become with higher housing pressure, causing higher displacement. It also shows you the trend lines from all 10 years. So you can see it's not exact, but you can see it's also very close, that there are trends that are common, and the outlier years are 2012 and 2021 because of the pandemic, but that in general, they follow pretty closely. So here you can take away years if you want to. So I could take away a 2012 if I want to. I could also take it. You see how that moved away my outliers? For some reason, 2012 was a challenging year. On the data didn't match the same. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you it tends to be an outlier. But you can choose your years here as you choose to tell the stories. And again, you can choose here what COC you want. So I mentioned I'm in the 603. So I'm able to click this, and you're able to see Fort Myers. And so you would remember that I mentioned before that Fort Myers used to be under 3.0. Then we went to 4.0, as you can see, and this dot here. And now you can see 5.1. So we recently wrote a paper that acknowledges that we have a 5.1 housing pressure alarm because we know across the country that as soon as you cross this line, you have to make significant system investments in order to have the same experience you're having and not have more people pressured out of housing, put into a system and stuck in the throughput system. And if you're a practitioner, I wonder if you can relate. But what that usually feels like is that people who've been working very hard in the sector for throughput, meaning outreach, coordinated entry, diversion, prevention to rapid rehousing, all of a sudden have too many people to work with and not enough resources. And when that happens, what we've seen historically is in a lot of communities is that they blame the people helping, and they blame the people that we're helping, those in need. So they're blaming those who've displaced. And what's terrible right now, and you might have seen the article in the AARP, is that there's an estimation that we could experience 3 times the level of seniors that we've experienced before in the next 10 years. It's the graying of the home service sector. And so how would we blame a senior who retired, who's now being pressured out of housing because they don't have the capacity to increase their income at the rate of housing increases? And this data gives us those tools so that we can have a reasonable conversation about our neighbors and involve solutions that honors our neighbors as legacy residents and really makes a difference. And so you can, as you're playing with yours, choose where you are. Here's Boise, Idaho. You would guess that Boise is always interesting to us because of the federal lawsuit that was there that changed national policy. But look at Boise. Boise went from 3.0 to over 6. If you track their time, we should have looked and said, Boise is going to come to a point where they're going to have to make very difficult decisions. And part of our question to AEI when we started this is if we could help provide insights and foresights so that communities could make decisions before a housing crash, a housing pressure crash on the low end, then should we do that before it ends up in legal systems? And of course, their answer was yes. Our challenge was then, could we? And our answer is yes. Now we have the insights for foresights to make better decisions. Let me look real quick at the questions and answers, or the questions before we move on. Oh, good. Most of those can be dismissed. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. So this one becomes one of our most powerful tools. As I'll tell you, it's one of my favorites. I'm not sure if I said that a few times already. If I have, please forgive me. But this one allows us to look at multiple cities at once. So right now, we've had the privilege of sharing life navigation in Houston, and most of you would know that Houston has done a fabulous job. If you paid attention and saw this morning's recording, you would know that Houston has made a lot of good land use that allows people to be housed. We also look at Denver. Denver's hitting national news. It's one of 7 cities chosen by the White House to put a White House representative in because Denver has had a significant increase in their rate of displacement. It's not surprising to us as we look of Denver going from 4.0 to 6.1. And again, all of these are live data all over. So if you want specific information that you can look, but if we look at Denver had a 4.1 displacement pressure and a 2.2 displacement rate. That would be 2.2 per 1,000 people. Now Denver has a 6.1 and they have a displacement rate of 2.1, still close to the same. The issue is that their population has grown so much that percentage point per 1,000 people causes an increase of those without housing. Last year, 44% of people in Denver who experienced homelessness experienced it for the first time. That's telling. And what I know in Denver, as they continue to buy hotels for non-congregate shelter, is that the system is full of families, it's full of seniors, it's full of those who normally would be housed, good neighbors that need a place to live. And then on that, we look at the other extreme, which you see, which is LA. So as we look at LA, what we see is LA went again from 7.5 to 9. Sorry, I have to move my webinar chat to 9.8. And so that we see LA has increased and their rates have increased as well. And what this allows us to do, and you can do yours right over here, is you can choose the states that you would like to look at and how you would like to compare. So if I put in here 603, as I mentioned before, in Fort Myers, it will pull up Fort Myers for me. I can click on the button and it gives me that nice comparison of where is Fort Myers. So Fort Myers as a community is having housing pressure that is greater than Houston, which would be problematic as our population is much smaller. Ian causes a great difficulty as well. We're now at 5.1. So we now have housing pressure that is like Denver. So paying attention to Denver makes sense to us. Denver has housing pressure that is moving towards where LA used to be. And so we're able to track communities and see how people, how systems behaved. We can do that with their 10-year plans. We can look at their land uses, which we can do through the heat index at AEI, and we can see the results of their systems. But when systems start crashing, we're able to say, oh, that we can see that's true because that continues to be true across the country. The other thing is, and you can help us figure out the best way to say it, is we can also say when someone has a solution, we understand that that's a reasonable solution. We've never seen it work before, meaning that those places who've tried that solution have not seen it work. You can't shelter your way out of this issue. You can't build enough government funding out of this issue. It doesn't mean that shelters and government subsidized housing are not important, but what we know is that we need to, one, reduce the amount of people who experience displacement in the first place, and two, make sure that the speed to rehousing is increasing, and three, that happens, of course, through naturally affordable housing within communities. And so again, here you have all of these tools. You can select years, you can select your COC down here. Anything that becomes your preference, you can play with. As in all of these tools, you'll see down on the right, there is a download tool that once you get the perfect table, I mean, you love it. It has everything you want in it. Hit that little download tool and you can download that. For Tableau users, you know what this looks like. It will give you a PowerPoint or a PDF or however you want to receive that information, and or that you can share it. So you can absolutely customize your good neighbors index for your needs and for your policymakers. And what we find is that the data allows us to move away again from anecdotes and to solutions. And so that's a great privilege for us.
Before you move on,
sir.
Just so I mentioned earlier how the point in time data come out. They're taken in January. Local COCs start releasing the data March, April, May, June. You may have seen articles in the Wall Street Journal where they tried to gather up, if you stay on that last chart, please, they gather up all this information, but the federal government doesn't release it until December. But we do know, going back to Houston, Denver, and LA, that Houston from 2022 to 2023 had a slight increase in the absolute number in their homeless count. So their displacement rate is going to be virtually unchanged. We don't have the population numbers yet, but we know that the population didn't change a whole lot between 2022 and 2023, and the count number was virtually unchanged. However, when you go to Denver, which in Denver we had, and I'll wait for this to catch up, we had a relatively flat PI displacement rate with an increasing displacement pressure, and the last displacement rate and pressure is shown for 2022. But we now know that would be a displacement rate of January 2022. We now know the January 30th, 2023 displacement number increased from 2022 to 2023 by 32%. So we know that that number that's around 2 is probably more like 2.6 or 2.7 in 2023. Again, the population will not have changed very much. The displacement pressure may have gone up a little bit, but what's really going on, and as Ethan said, this can foretell to some extent what's happening. And so you've seen this increase over the last couple of years in displacement rate. It's now in displacement pressure. It's now showing a displacement rate. Now we're going to look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles, as you can see, has been going up year after year after year as the displacement pressure has been going up pretty much year after year after year. However, in 2023, there was a 9% rise in the displacement count. And so that count was at, what is 2022 running, Ethan, 7 point something, 8%, 7.1. So if you have a 10% increase and the population, give or take, is roughly the same, you're going to be looking at a number about 7.6, 7.7. Therefore, we see that LA continues to increase as its displacement pressure increases. And so we're trying to get, as Ethan said, the most up-to-date information we can. We're hamstrung to some extent by how long it takes to publish the point-in-time information. We're looking at ways of trying to get it more expeditiously, but right now we have to wait until HUD releases it in December 2023. Back to you, Ethan.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And so practitioners, one of the things that we've done, just like Ed did, is when we've gotten calls for assistance, those who give us calls for assistance have been helping us with their 23 numbers. And that helps us. We can add a dot onto the PowerPoint of where we believe they are. But because AEI is very particular, and I mean that with the highest respect and compliments, we tend not to post it until we have all the data sets, because that way, if we're off, or you can have full credibility in the data that you're sharing. But we do recognize that sometimes there'll be local data that allows that, and again, that allows for efficacy because it increases the urgency, it increases the locality, it being local to you, and it's a great tool to have. It says, okay, this is what we're experiencing this year, and then we confirm your local data with this national data, and we believe that that's very effective. As mentioned, we will be trying to figure out more ways to figure out quarterly data, because we know that some communities have quarterly data, but that, as you would know if you're a practitioner, has to be released by the local COC. And so that can be somewhat challenging in itself. And so if we go to number 5, we would go back to the map by state by year. And I apologize if my computer takes a moment. Good. And so again, this is the 1 year. As soon as I click the 5 year, you'll see the whole country's lit up. This is a good time for us to share with you the Good Neighbors Index by color chart, which is on the bottom. You may have picked this up already. Is what we looked at was first displacement rate, which is point in time displacement per 1,000 people. We recognize that there is a natural rate in each community. We call that natural. That says it's less than 2%. Of the population, or less than 2% per thousand, and then it goes up to extreme, which would be greater than 4.8%. On the other side, you see displacement pressure, which would be low, which would be less than 3, moderate between 3 and 4, serious between 4 and 5, severe between 5 and 7, and extreme above 7. This allowed the color coding that you see. It made it much easier visually to understand and see what's going on. And it also allows for talking points within communities to say, okay, currently you may have a serious housing pressure, but you're actually natural in the sense of your system is behaving the way that we would expect it to. Or we might say you have a serious issue, but you're extreme, your system is not doing well at all. And we tend to get the most calls. I tend to get the most calls from practitioners when their community is going from that natural to moderate, or moderate to serious, because they're experiencing a new level of displacement that's causing them social discomfort of individuals. And so that's how we did that. The map here allows us to do, as we said before, you can change the years, you can see who's behaving like you and where, and you can hover over communities. So this is by state. If you want to look at New Hampshire or Vermont, what that looks like, of course, California, Florida, but this would be how the state is behaving, and this is a state-by-state map. For those of you who work at the state level, I find this is good because you can actually start with a state map, say this is how our state's behaving, and then from there, you can use that information to look at regions and differentiate between a region. And because I went out so much, it might take me 1 second to get back. So let me see what I can do here. There it is. I'm going to go then to version 7, which is the displacement rate by COC by year. And for the practitioners, have you been in a community where your community spent a massive amount of money for someone to give you data, bring it back to you, and share your own data with you? What this does is this collects a great deal of data around communities and allows us to use that data. For some reason, I'm going to have to reset my thing, so apologize for that. Causes us to use that data or make that data available to us so that we can answer questions. So here's your point in time count per 1,000 people. Again, you can see the COCs listed, you can see your years, you can see colors, and it just gives you a national map to make decisions on based on those other ones. Some people prefer the map for decision making and comparison. Some people prefer the scatter plot. This gives you the tool, thank you very much, AEI, to make that determination. But we have found that when we're looking at states as a whole, that sometimes taking a state in and then breaking up that state allows us to do it. As in, I'm in Florida, you see that little red dot, that's Monroe County, that includes Key West, that was in 2022. But you can also see what's happened across the country over the years. So if we look at 2015, you can see there's a lot less dark colors. 2017, they start growing. And then you can highlight an area if you want to, as we did before. We can highlight all the 9s, which would be LA, Atlanta, Detroit, and Chicago. Or if you want to, you can highlight 603, which would be Fort Myers. Or you can search for by name, which would be a Denver, which is a 503. And then you can click on that again. You can hover over it and get the data that you want for the year. So this gives you the same information in multiple formats based on your visual preferences and your data preferences. And then you're able to, again, download those and put them in reports, which is very helpful for the policymakers. It's giving them the tools they need to make decisions early. And then, so we have a displacement reduction potential. Ed, I'm pleased to pause on this one if you would like to do this, or if Tobias would. I can, but I know that you do it better than I do. This is a displacement reduction potential for the country. Again, you can look at the COC, which in this case, I'll put in LA again.
So basically, as we saw something like this on this morning session, as we pointed out, the higher the home prices and the higher, which generally reflects construction costs don't vary tremendously across the country. Land prices do vary tremendously across the country. Therefore, if you have much higher home prices, it's generally reflective of much higher land prices, and then that land share is much higher. And those prices are what's causing the displacement pressure. And as we talked this morning, the flip side of all of that is where you have high displacement pressure, you also have high potential for displacement reduction through light touch density. And if you pan out a bit, leaving LA highlighted, you'll see that all those red areas, which are showing where there's lots of displacement potential, are out on the West Coast, around Denver, COC, and some of the other places on the East Coast. And the great swath of the rest of the country has got low potential because they, in general, have much lower land prices and land shares. But again, this is a convenient way of looking at it and saying the connection between the displacement rate, which we're showing here, and home prices relative to incomes is clear, and also the connection between reducing displacement rate and using light touch density to do that is also clear based on the research. Back to you, Ethan.
Thank you. I'm going to, good. So as we look then, as we continue through our tools, what we will see is, sorry, sometimes it takes a moment, and I've learned to accept that because it's moving through a ton of data in order to do this for us. So we do make decisions based on data and time, but that is one that does come up. There it is. And so that's potential. Then we look at displacement pressure versus one bedroom rent. And what you'll see is, again, as you look at the year, you'll look at displacement pressure here, which again is median home price to total income. And then you will look at the rental costs. And what we see is that those places is based on a food worker index, which is a large portion of many communities. You can see what how much they have to pay, what percentage of their salary they have to pay for housing. Again, if you can check by highlight. So if we do the nines, we can see what that looks like. Here would be Atlanta. Here would be LA. And here would be Detroit and Chicago. So we could also check if you wanted to for ours, which would allow us to see that in the 603. Again, it allows a Fort Myers. We'll find it. There's El Paso, Alexandria, Virginia, Santa Maria. And so what you're able to do is you're able to see what is, let me check Fort Myers and see. Fort Myers is a pretty small dot compared to the rest. Is what you'll see is that Fort Myers for a one bedroom, our team would tell you they're hard to find, but they're $1,400 a month. It's nearly 60% of a food worker's salary. If they only had a single job, we know what that would look like. The food worker median income would be 29,000. Point in time count would be 560. Again, and this is coming from the job survey and the ACS information. And so this information is federally available information. Sometimes people are like, well, that's not true. And it's fair. I understand the challenges of when people say it's not true. It's not true where they live or what they see, meaning some people do not go into the neighborhoods where rent can be found for $1,400 a month. And so it would not be true for their choice of life, but it is true of what's reported nationally for those areas. Again, you can check the years that you want to.
2019, and go to 5-year.
And then we
So
take up.
this is notice the R squared up in the upper left is 56 to 59% for this particular scatter plot. So it's somewhere in the upper 50s. If you go back and you were to look at the other scatter plot that was looking at displacement rate versus displacement pressure, that had an R squared for 2019 for all the COCs 5-year of 78%. That goes back to our point. The relationship, the explanatory power of the displacement rate versus displacement pressure is much greater. That relationship is much greater than the explanatory power of the price to rent relationship shown on this scatter plot. That's not to say this isn't important, but that's why we focus so much on the Good Neighbor Index being built around displacement rate, displacement pressure. It has a very high explanatory power, and when you get to the COCs of 1 million or more, which there are lots of COCs of 1 million or more, that R squared goes up to, I believe it was 85%, something on that order of 89%. So it's even higher. And so that's why we really focus on that relationship. Back to you, Ethan.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. As a practitioner, many people will say, well, that doesn't explain everything. And we can say absolutely true. But in communities over 1 million people, there's a relationship between it at an 89% level, the R squared, which means it explains most of it. Another great tool that we did, which is tool 10, which is wage by occupation. This is a tool that we did. I call this a Birmingham tool. We did this for Birmingham, Alabama. And part of that is in Birmingham, the Salvation Army has a very good workforce development program. And so when they do that program, if you look at the color key, they picked out 25 jobs that are within the space that we normally serve, and then a few more. And then what AI did is put on the median annual rent or contract rent. What's that recorded for the market in the year? And so we're able to say what jobs are there. Now, this again can be downloaded, which I'll show you in a moment. But a benefit of this is that you have live data on each one, which tells you the number of employees that are recorded in the market, how much they make, and what percentage of their salary is needed to afford housing a one-bedroom apartment. So in Houston, which is the example here, you'll see in Houston, the median annual wage of someone in healthcare support operations is $28,300. About 116,000 people in that workforce. But when we look at it, that would take more than 45% of a salary to do it. We know, and we're pretty comfortable that at about 33% of income towards housing causes significant social issues. So we would expect this person either has a second income in the house or a second income themselves. And you can change and go down the dots. So if we look in LA, we see that LA, the median annual wage for food preparation and serving is 34,000, roughly 500,000 people in those spaces, 8.8% of the job market. 6,100 people in that space. But a rent would take about 57% of your income. And so again, they would have to have a second income, which of course would be pretty standard, but you can go down and see different jobs. And why this is good for us is in our services is we're saying, okay, in order to help someone get a job that is sustainable for housing, this is the job market they need to be in. They need to be under 35%, preferably under 30%. So the reason we do that is that we want to make sure that if we're doing job training, that we're not helping people spend a lot of effort getting another job that won't pay rent, but we can look for those jobs that have a high placement rate, that may have certificates, may have a shorter training period, and work with people to enhance their employability to those jobs. And so this tool has become very useful for us. We're very appreciative of it. But you can also look at the years here. So you can change years like in the other ones. So if we want to go to I think I hit 2018, but if you want to go to 2018 or 19, if you want to change the state, if you want to change the CBSA, you can look and see different markets or if you want to change different occupancies. So if you are in the work of enhancing employability or increasing income, then this becomes a tremendous data tool set because you can actually record and download up-to-date data for what you're training and why you're training it. So you can see the occupations are down here. You can turn them all on. You can shut them off, whatever your case may be. You can choose your job market space. To note, your CBSA may be a different calculated space than your COC, but the tool is useful for policy, even though it may not be calculated to your COC. And of course, you can choose your state location that you want, and it will pull up the major markets in those states. So that's all information that becomes available to you. And Ed, did I hear?
Yeah, so one thing we've done, if you can go to the state of Texas, turn off all the states and then select Texas, and then select all metros. We've expanded the number of metros that can be shown on this chart. I think it's now 16 or 17, if there are that many in a state. And so California and Texas have a lot of CBSAs. We're still working on how to show even more, but I think we've got it up to 16 or 17. And then if you pick all CBSAs in Texas, you'll see a whole raft of CBSAs show up, and you can pick, the ones that you're interested in. But again, the yellow line is the rent and in annual, and you see that Austin has the highest rents. Midland is basically second highest. but Houston's on here somewhere. There's not enough room to list every metro down on the x-axis. They're all there. They're just hidden, so you'd have to search around to highlight Houston or whatever. But then you can see all the dots where all the dots are. So there's tons and tons of information here, and you can compare your metro to any other metros that are similar size. You can compare people to metros that are near yours that you maybe people are moving back and forth. I know when you were in Tennessee, there were people moving from Nashville to Memphis, Knoxville, and Chattanooga because Nashville was getting so expensive. And you can actually see why those pressures to move are developing by looking at this type of information. Back to you, Ethan.
Yes, and for those who are in the space, I encourage you to listen to this morning. You can see the migration of how people move, and those are very helpful tools. So I would encourage you to look at the arbitrage reports, the migration reports. Those are very helpful in these spaces. And I would also encourage, and Ed, if you want to speak into, I would also encourage those of you who are in markets where they're doing economic development in spaces that won't help housing costs, that tools like this allow us to say, if you're going to bring in a company that pays less than, then we need to make sure that there's a housing solution for them, because that housing space is already very crowded. So in Austin, it may be a salary that needs to be closer to $65,000 a year or $60,000 a year, or it might be something a salary that's over 30, because as the salary goes up, of course the dot goes down because it's a lower percentage. But this allows us to advocate in the economic development space to encourage housing to be built for the jobs that they're recruiting. Because unfortunately, sometimes we recruit jobs in and we create pressure or we don't have housing for the jobs that we created. And then we wonder why we're having a housing crisis. Ed, did you want to speak to that at all?
I just repeat what I said this morning for those who weren't on this morning. Savannah, attracted Hyundai to build a huge plant, electric batteries, electric vehicles, to an area around Savannah, a little bit west of core Savannah, and it's going to have 8,000 jobs. They're well-paying jobs, but unless you have the housing that goes along with those jobs, as we pointed out this morning, the biggest predictor of what happens with house prices, number one, is how many jobs and what are the wages of those jobs. That directly translates into demand for single family homes, both attached and detached. So house price appreciation directly correlates to that. If you want to mitigate excessive, having very rapid house price appreciation, what is the flip side of rapid house price appreciation? It's rapid increase in the displacement rate. Why? Well, the prices are going up faster than incomes. If prices go up faster than incomes, then you're going to have a rising displacement rate. We're not suggesting that house prices go down or they don't go up at all. We're just suggesting that they need to go up in some relationship to incomes. As soon as they're going up much faster than incomes, your displacement rate goes up. And therefore, if you're going to attract 8,000 jobs, but you're not going to have the policies in place to provide the housing for those 8,000 additional jobs, then you're going to have upward pressure on home prices, and that's going to put upward pressure on displacement rate. Back to you, Ethan.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. Friends, what it does is it gives us a reasonable argument to say, why are we under pressure? Because there's housing pressure, there's economic pressure. People know it's true and they share anecdotally, but many times, I've been doing this for a long time, but many times in the last 25 years, we just haven't had the data to share what we were experiencing, and this gives us the data. And so this next one is another fan favorite. It's displacement pressure, which is median price and median total income and displacement rate with point in time count per 1,000 years. And it's just another way to track those dots that you've seen before, but some people like them connected in this way. And so again, you'll see Houston here. You can track their data. Again, you can move your over the data across the chart. And then Here would be LA. Again, down here, you can check in what that looks like. So if I want to shut them all off, it takes a moment. Let's say that I wanted to do Florida. I can hit Florida, right? Obviously, Florida is going to pop up, and then I can just click in on those for Florida and see what those look like and how do they compare. And in doing that, what it does is it allows us to say, okay, how are we comparing with others in the state? Again, I can take Florida off and right, and then undo them. But you can check by state, you can check by location, whatever your preference is. We look at Colorado. Colorado has 3 COCs. California has a ton of COCs. So what this does, and the reason I like this so much, is that when I'm looking at an area and someone says, okay, we're thinking we want to behave like Denver, we want to behave like Houston or LA, which doesn't happen very often, but I think you understand my point, is I can say, okay, well, let's look and see how they're behaving and see if that's a behavior that you actually want and how they're dealing with it. Because sometimes we know that people are better at promoting solutions than their data shows. And this allows for a data reference to see if you want to follow that. So you can choose anywhere that you want to. Again, if I take off, I can go and look at the 999s. Los Angeles, Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Look at Atlanta go from 7.0 on the displacement down to recorded 4.9. Sorry, 2.1. 2.1 would be tremendous. I'll be curious to see if that's what they're experiencing and that is accurate, but that is absolutely what they're reporting. If we look at Detroit, you also see a decline reported. If we look at Chicago, we see a decline reported. When we look at LA, we see a massive increase. Part of this is that as we look at solutions, we may want to make sure that we're looking at places that are finding progress and not behaving as if everyone behaves the same.
Can you go back to tool 10, please, Ethan, and pick Tennessee for 2022, pick Tennessee and click on all CBSAs. I want to show that example of Nashville and how if you're looking, even if you're in Nashville and yeah, I'll wait for it to catch up.
Yeah, it's pretty fast. I'm a little slow, but thanks for your patience.
Okay, so you're going to see Nashville on the far left, and it basically sets the mark for both rents and inability to afford those rents for many of the occupational classes. And you're hovering on the food prep, which is up at 60%. You can see some of the food prep is down at 40% for Knoxville. But if you look at the purple, which is what is purple?
Transportation and material moving.
Transportation material. If you look actually at healthcare support occupations, I would say healthcare support occupations are something relatively portable. That's the mustard colored one. So that's up at 48% roughly in Nashville. But if you look at Knoxville, it's down at about 34% and even lower in Clarksville and some other places. So you could say to someone, if you can't improve your lot in Nashville, maybe you could relocate, and maybe $500 or $1,000 to help relocate to a Knoxville in that occupation would put a person to where they now can be sustainable with their housing in terms of rent. So just another way of looking at these data. And this was going on in Nashville, not necessarily in the displacement area, but just people were moving out of Nashville to some of the other cities, Memphis, Chattanooga, Knoxville, and even cities 1 or 2 counties away from Nashville Do you have anything to add to that, Ethan, before you take it back over?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely true. So some communities now experience a lot of traveling nurses, contracted nurses, which the healthcare system will tell you is much more expensive because that person who is this has this very transferable skill is now able to move from Nashville up to Clarksville, and the share of income that has to go to their housing went down significantly, right? So now it's 32%, whereas in Nashville it was 46%. So their rent essentially was at a crisis level, or their housing sustainability was at a crisis level. They're moving up the road, they're making a little less, but they're able to find housing at a much lower cost. And so beautiful places like Kingsport and Johnson City can benefit from that. Jackson is growing quickly because they benefit from that. And it makes sense why people are moving into some of the small towns, even as California effect, if you were there this morning, is California may be moving into a Nashville, Tennessee, or north of Chattanooga and Maryville. However, when they do, then those local people may even move into a smaller community, and you have this ripple effect that happens, and then put on top of that inflation and transportation. So this data gives you a lot of insights that you can use for foresights, and then have those conversations with the Chamber of Commerce, Economic Development, and others, so that you're having a conversation about the full community quality of life. And you'll note that we're having all these conversations and we're rarely repeating the word that we didn't want, because housing pressure is housing pressure. Housing displacement is those are pressured out. And having these conversations actually helps solve the issue, which allows the market to respond to the need in itself. So next we're going to look at 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. When we get to 13 through 16, what we're going to see there is we're going to see what is now data that's usually brought from, excuse me for that, is these are metrics that are required by HUD in the AHAR, the annual homeless report. And so assessment report. And so this is data that's automatically uploaded from the local continuum of care through the regional office to HUD. We then receive that information and use it here. What's interesting is that how many communities argue with their own information, to which my response is it is your federal information that you're answering, and in some places need a lot better data sources, and we have tools to do that, to gather data. But this is the data as it comes. I still have in the 999s as that's what I left on the previous one, excuse me. But you can change that for any information that you want. So here would be LA, as you would expect, Detroit, Atlanta, Chicago, and there we have the numbers from 2007. Would anyone paying attention, would anyone listening know why we start with 2007? I'll give you the answer, because that's the first AHAR data. So again, great appreciation to AEI for the Good Neighbors Index. In 25 years of paying attention to this data, I can tell you this is the first time I've ever had our AHAR data, our HUD data, in the same data sets as housing data and economic data. Traditionally, we would have to spend a significant amount of efforts and sometimes a significant amount of money to get this data. And so this is the first time that we're aware of that it's available in one place. And again, I want to commend to you the co-directors, Edward Pinto and Tobias Peter, for doing this, Arthur and the team for making it happen. But you'll see that this is your AHAR report. So in it, you would see the point in time report. You would also see first time homeless count in emergency shelter, which first time count obviously is very important as you're trying to reduce those who are getting assistance. And then the second one includes permanent housing and COCs. Again, this data, like the other data, you can highlight all, you can take them off, and then you can choose who you want in that. Then to choose who you want, you can choose like a LA if you want to. You can choose Fort Myers if you want to. You can see how quickly I'm doing it once you get used to it. You can choose Houston if you want to. And we can choose a Denver. Those are ones that I typically look at because it's kind of, it tells me it's who's behaving well, who's behaving poorly. If I take off the 603, it'll help a little bit because we'll talk about communities about the same size. But again, now I can see my comparison. So here's LA, here's Denver, here's Houston. And when we're giving counsel or encouragement, we can encourage to behave in certain ways because of responses. And again, friends, if you need to, there is a download button, so you can download any graph that you have when you have it. And the good thing is, if you're a practitioner, for most of us, we only need to download this once a year. After we have that in a PowerPoint, it's solid until the next data is out. As mentioned previously, there may be local information that we want to add on there. Point in time for 2023, you probably have that for your community. You can add those on there. But it's once you do it once, it becomes very useful. But I find the live data and the hovers very helpful as I'm doing it because it's helped me change my language and it's helped me answer questions for decision and policymakers. Yes, so the anonymous attendee, you got it. That's right. That COC is a large report, and so we'll look at that reporting in just a minute. Just trying to get some questions and answers in the middle, so perfect. So then we'll go to the other metrics that are there. So that was group 1. Group 2 metrics allows us to look at median days in emergency shelter, emergency or safe haven. You'll notice that the differences that HUD keeps. So the first one includes safe havens, and the second one is average days. So median days versus average days. And what that looks at is when we're looking at it, if you take first your first time experiencing displacement or homelessness, and then you look at the number of days, it makes sense why shelters fill up, and then encampments fill up, and then streets fill up, because the amount of days for re-entry is too long. It's the idea of making it rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. If it is not brief, then of course your number of chronics will increase, and then with that, the social ills that people have to experience increase. So this gives us great data. Here you would note that successful street outreach is important. This is a place that Salvation Army loves in the sense of meeting people, building relationships, helping them get to rehousing when the resources are there. And again, like all of our other tools, you do have a search function up here. You can choose the area that you want to look at and compare. Again, our standards that are on the reports are Los Angeles, Denver, and Houston, because those are markers. And I trust that each one of you will determine your own markers that you prefer in these spaces. But as we, as practitioners with you, look at the data, it does give us a sense of what's behaving and who's behaving. So if we look at LA, we see that on LA in 2019 or 2021, sorry, they're reporting their median count per 1,000. I'm looking at their numbers of days. 74. So their median days in 2021 is recorded as 74. We know that our goal, of course, would be less than 60 or 45. A lot of communities are having a hard time with that, but theirs is 74. And typically what we see is before unsheltered increases and before encampments increase, number of days in shelters increase. Why? Because when shelters become full and over full, they tend to be less hospitable. As they're less hospitable, people find other places to be. And as that happens, then that length of time changes. So that's an important factor. And then we also look at the percentage of successful placement in housing from street outreach, the understanding that unsheltered individuals with rapid rehousing can move into housing if there's resources to do that. This gives you those data tools to say, how would you like to approach that? As you know, some systems still require emergency shelter usage as part of the process, which would not be my professional recommendation. Is we meet people where they are, offer them shelter, of course, and I understand that's a successful street placement, but helping them get into housing as quickly as possible. And so these are straight from your AHAR reports. And again, you would have data faster than we do. We can only get that once a year. And so you can update that with your data sets. Let me go into that next one. Percentage returning to homeless, of course, that's the question that we have as we use rapid rehousing is, you help people get into housing, but how many of them didn't work? This is a place, friends, that I find that anecdotes, unfortunately, really harm our funding a great deal. Because someone will say is, I know that Bob lived under a bridge. You helped Bob get housing. I saw Bob on the corner. Bob is no longer housed. And so because we only can see those unsuccessful cases, they tend to become the narrative. But what we know nationally is good and proper rapid rehousing has an 85% success rate, which means, yes, there are those who are not being successful, but there are those who are. So if we look at what was recorded for the 6 months of 2015 to 2021, in 2021, we see that in Houston, they're reporting 11.3% return. And 11.3% is amazing. Congratulations, Houston, which means that the majority of people they're housing in 6 months continue to stay housed. And in 12 months, at 15% return. So they're hitting their 85% goal. And so with proper supports, 85% are still in housing. Does that mean everyone? No. But let's not let the anecdote of Bob on the corner who was under the bridge ruin the funding that allows people to be focused on supports. Others in Denver, they're reporting a 9.6%. Again, very good rates. In LA, they're reporting a 4%, which is extremely low. And what we find when it's extreme is we ask that system, is this what you're experiencing? And in some systems, you would know, some systems do not have the housing support to report those who are back in the system, nor do they have good coordinated entry to report those who are back on the streets. So if LA is indeed hitting 4.1%, I'd say congratulations. And I would just encourage them to share that data to say that's what they're hitting when they're doing it. And if they are, it's probably because they're doing full year subsidies, which allows them to hit that 12 months. And as they're able to do that, or if they're able to do that, that's good. But remember, we know that light touch density and naturally affordable housing, reducing housing pressure is always a lower cost than these tools that we're using to put people in housing and or maintain housing. So the lower the housing pressure, the lower cost and the lower the maintenance of it, which is an important factor to consider as we're looking at all of the data sets. If we look at data metrics 4, this one's good. So this is a newer one, and again, AEI, thank you very much for this tool. Is the point in time in housing inventory count. What share of shelter beds are occupied? And when we look at what share of shelter beds are occupied, we would say that sometimes shelters were overfull, sometimes shelters are underfull, but it gives us a recognition that sometimes there's a lot of shelter beds that are available that just are not being used. So we have the point in time in housing inventory count. So if we look at unsheltered homeless share, we would see that the unsheltered share in point in time count for Los Angeles was 72%. 72% of those counted were unsheltered at that time. If we look in Houston, we'll see it was 48%. And in Denver, it was 26%. What's interesting in that, and some of you would say it's what shelters are available, sometimes it's weather, sometimes it's a combination of those. But what I would encourage is for those people who have low shelter attendance, which is high shelter vacancy, is looking at the shelter and is it a hospitable environment that's causing a choice of participation, or are they finding an encampment more hospitable? And so data like this allows us to ask questions like that by looking at the historical trends for the amount of people in the point in time, the housing inventory, and the number of people in shelter beds. And so if we look at this one as point in time housing inventory count, and we can see Los Angeles again is that spike, right? It's the unsheltered count over years. Whereas if we were to take out LA, we would see that Houston would be going, Denver's there, Houston, there it is, right? As we see that Houston has actually been going down over time. Again, all of those are live data points with hovers, so you can hover right along the years, which thank you, AI. These are just tremendous tools, but you can hover along the years. You can compare who you want to compare, whether in your state, whether a city, and how you're comparing to others. And this will help make policy decisions. My encouragement with this is that the first metrics and scatter plots on the Good Neighbors Toolkit, those are great for policymakers. The latter ones are really good for practitioners. And as you work on your framing, I would encourage you to make sure that you're having the right conversation with the right people. With policymakers, our primary conversation needs to be light touch density, creates natural affordable housing, reducing housing pressure, and housing displacement. In practitioners, we can get into issues of how many days, how many beds, and whatnot. When we don't keep it simple, stupid, thank you, Ed, when we don't use the KISS principle with too much data, then the practitioners get lost and it's easy for them not to make decisions. So my encouragement is to use that natural affordable housing reduces housing pressure, reduced housing pressure reduces housing displacement, reduction in housing displacement allows all good neighbors to be at home. And so even as we share these data tools, I encourage you to use them to make decisions, but also to be cautious you don't get lost in them. Again, to the courtesy and complement of AEI Housing Center, you'll see that the point in time counts by COC, sheltered, unsheltered, total beds, empty beds are all listed on the bottom of the table. And again, that can be downloaded for reporting. And so all of these tools can be used to create reports for your community. And from those reports, create.
Before you move on, could you go back down to the bottom of that last report? So this is interesting all the way to the bottom. Yeah, I want to look at the count, the total beds. So we've talked about Houston a lot, we've talked about LA a lot, talked about Denver a bit. So look at the number of beds in Houston, 3,000 roughly. Look at the number of empty beds. Look at the number of unsheltered homeless. They have as many empty beds as they have unsheltered homeless, but they don't have that many beds compared to Los Angeles has 26,000 beds. And they have 5,000 empty, but they have 48,000 unsheltered. And so the solution Los Angeles tends to lean towards is we need to build more shelters. Well, as Ethan can describe, shelters aren't the solution. Housing is the solution. Shelters aren't housing, they're temporary. Housing is the solution, and having a housing supply be abundant is the solution, and having rapid rehousing into that housing supply is the solution. So when you talk to someone from Houston, and I've talked to the mayor's special assistant in Houston for homeless numerous times, and he'll point out, look, our goal is not to put people in shelters. That's our last choice. Our goal is to put people in housing, and we will, even if somebody's out on the street unsheltered, might leave them there for 3 or 4 weeks, because that's less disruptive than putting them into shelter and then moving them to housing. So while we're working on moving them into housing, and they have a tremendous success rate on that, as we talked about this morning, it may take us 3 or 4 weeks to do that. While we're doing that, we're going to leave them unsheltered, but then we're going to move them into housing and bypass putting them into shelter. Because if you ask people, do you want to move into a shelter? The answer largely is no. Do you ask them, would you like to have housing? The answer is yes. And so you go directly to the goal, which is housing. And so Houston has a very concerted effort to work with landlords, work with the housing supply that's there, and basically keep a list of landlords. They may facilitate someone moving from unsheltered into a home. They may provide some rental assistance for a while. They may provide the security deposit assistance. They might provide some other assistance. But at the end of the day, one of the things they do is that unit is in the name of the person who was formerly homeless. So at the end of, let's say it's a 1-year lease, at the end of 1 year, that lease is in their name. And if they want to stay there and they have the wherewithal to do that, they can stay in that unit. It's not temporary housing. It's permanent housing that they can stay in if they want to, and they're paying the rent, et cetera. And as I said, this morning, they have over a 90% continuation rate after it was 2 or 3 years. 90% of the people they put into housing, permanent housing, are still there after a couple of years. That's an incredible statistic that Los Angeles can't meet those numbers. You can just see from here, when you have 48,000 unsheltered, that you can't possibly be accomplishing those numbers. Back to you, Ethan.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Ed. If you want to see a different example of that, I invite you to look at Denver's 2013 report, which at the time was very encouraging. Denver was having a good few years, but in their report, they had a lot of system improvements, which Denver did a good job. Denver had a very strong system. But when it came to answering the housing issue, Denver did what most cities do the first time. They said, we will deal with that issue next. And Denver actually concentrated on getting multiple shelters approved and said, we will concentrate on shelter zoning approval. And so what Denver ended up with was a lot of shelters, but what they didn't end up with is dealing with the housing pressure issue. And so now they have more shelter beds than they have. However, they also have higher housing pressure than anyone would want. And so, we encourage people to choose the right solution early so that you can stay in the green or stay in the yellow and not wait until it's very difficult, because in the future you are buying homes or you're renting apartments from yourself in your market, and you're just actually creating your own future problem. So like a oak tree, the best time to plant it was 20 years ago, but the next best time is today. Is allow the swarm to create housing that reduces the need for shelters. Then the last one is 17. What this shows is the median, how much worse is the median price to median total income ratio, meaning is this problem getting worse or is this problem getting better in locations? And so there was 2 charts that were done. Thank you very much, Tobias and team, on this. The first one is 2012 to 2022, and what you can see is that people's the cost, the displacement pressure in 2021 versus 2012, that if it was the same, it would be on that 45-degree line. So everyone to the left has experienced COCs where the median price to the total income ratio has increased. Anyone on the right, you would see they were decreased. So let's see where they decreased. Yonkers. I don't know that I've been to Yonkers, but Yonkers, or Atlantic City, or Scranton. But where did it increase? Well, we can see places like Las Vegas, San Jose, outside of LA, Marion County. And so we can see the speed at which they're doing. Thankfully, we also have the chart down here that says in buckets, how many did that happen to? How many communities did that increase? But we see that the majority of that increase, or a significant part of that increase, happened between 2019 and 2022. And so if you're in a community that's experienced like this increased pressure and you don't know how to talk about it, I would say absolutely you are. You're in a community that's experiencing something they haven't experienced before. And so with that being true, then you can highlight your community. So if we were to look at, again, a 603, right, then I can find Fort Myers. There's communities like it, Nassau, Fort Myers, right? So you can see how much our community's price has increased and pressure has increased over the last 3 years. If we were to do the 9s, we can see how much LA has increased. In the last 3 years, we can see how much Chicago and Detroit. Off of that, what would be, if it was equal, would be the 45-degree line. And so we can see that they've had increases in the median price to total income. But if you look at over 12 years, look at LA. And so when communities are facing issues, if we were to go back to our original tool, I'm curious if I've convinced you yet. Let's see. If we go back to our original tool, then we can see that as, let me use one more I use for. And this is Houston that's highlighted. I can do LA again. But as we look, if you're convinced by the data, which as Ed pointed out, and I'd like to point out again, has a R value of 0.89 for communities over 1,000, which means that the relationship between them has 0.89% significance, is you'll see that those communities with higher pressure have higher rates of displacement. Communities with lower pressure have lower rates of displacement. And so when we look at that and we look at all of that data together, it allows us to advocate for system, zoning, housing improvements. We're not talking about affordable housing. We're talking about allowing a swarm, as you heard this morning, of solution providers to build solutions throughout communities. Now, again, another tool that I showed you before, which is good, is you can highlight data. It will pull it up. It'll put it in a table so you can find it. And this will allow you all as practitioners to find new insights that we haven't had yet. And we look forward to that. And we'd ask that you'd be so kind to email this to us. But when you look at that, we're able to look at data from 10 years, communities like us, like experiences. Again, we're looking at housing pressure. We're looking at systems for rehousing, the opportunity for people to stay into housing with enhanced employability or increased income. But we see that those are connected. But in those, as we see here, I'm going to switch to, excuse me 1 second. Thank you. As mentioned before, the Good Neighbors Index predictors have over 369 continuum of cares over 10 years, has a 0.78 R-squared relationship of point in time to median price to median income ratio. It's 89% for COCs. This is higher than any of 54 variables that this team, thank you again, team, put through, including home ownership rates, median income rates, housing inventory, homeless management information systems, share of voters who voted for Trump or didn't vote for Trump, or median rent to total income. And a lot of practitioners stop on the rent discussion. And I would say if you stop there, you're stopping too early, because as you heard this morning, rent is a signifier, but it's not a signifier to the same extent. It's only a signifier of 46%, where median home price to median income signifies at R-squared of 0.78 or 0.89, but depending on the size of population. We even looked at buyers' income, average days in emergency shelter, food workers' income. An interesting one, if you're familiar with Raj Shetty's work on social connections too. We even looked at relationships and in areas in that, which comes out pretty close to median contract rent to median rent income. And so we went through all of these different factors, and I say we, it was AEI, and I appreciate being in the room, went through all of these different factors, but over and over the same answer came to be, is median price to median income ratio is the primary indicator. And if you need clarification on that, again, I invite you to listen to this morning's recording. But that is the data that we use for AEI. And so I'm going through. So in this tool, then what we saw is we see AEI transforming data into knowledge, information into knowledge, knowledge into action. Our hope is that you are the ones who translate the information into action. And because by creating better policy, we see communities creating solutions. And wouldn't it be nice to have 10, 15, 20 communities that we can celebrate as creating solutions? And we're seeing states move that way, and now it's time to see more cities. But here's a great tool, and this is a tremendous report. It's going to, I'm pleased to show you, is AEI was gracious enough to prepare for us a GNI COC print report. In that print report is the GNI infographic, an index map by COC, the pressure map, the displacement rate map, a colored table, your latest reports, scatter plots, GNI by year, wage and occupation, displacement pressure, median to median bedroom rent, the GNI metrics, group 1 through 3, and a recap with space for summary considerations. And I'm going to show you that now, because when I say that I help 40 communities, I've had weekends where I've done 4, and it sounds like a lot, and it's a little bit of work, but it's even better than that. So let me show you. So what it looks like is it looks like this. Is when you look at the chart, you'll see next to the tool, there's a GNI COC report. You hit the instruction button. It takes a moment. This report usually takes 2 minutes to come up. So know that it does have to have some space on your computer to do it in order to run it. So if you need to run it more than once, you may have to clear some space for it in your data history because of how it pulls. But you can put in your state. So if we put in, we've been discussing LA a lot. You put in your COC.
Like California.
Thank you. You mean that state? Sorry, I used to live in Louisiana.
Yeah.
I just seeing if anyone was still paying attention, Ed. No, thanks for catching that. And then when we look at Los Angeles is obviously a large COC. You go to the right. Sorry, I'm having to move a couple things around my desktop. You hit the download button. I tend to download things as a PDF. You hit all selected sheets. I hit select all, and you
The instructions are right there on the right.
And the instructions are right here on the right, in case you need to get those again. And what that looks like is it usually takes about 80 seconds to download, depending on your speed. My encouragement is don't hit the download button 12 times because you'll end up with 12 copies of the same report. It does take a moment for it to download because of the amount of data that I say it's sifting through. That's not the correct term, but you understand my point. And then you end up with a report that looks like this. So here's Los Angeles. You would recognize that first page. Here's a summary report, which shows their point in time information for 2022, 2021, shows median price income to ratio in 2012 versus 2022. Sorry, 2012 to 2022 there. Total housing units, detached housing units, potential additional light touch density units per 10-year period. You saw how that was calculated. So this is the summary page. This only took us 2 weeks, friends. This is our way of being as simple as we can in a 1 page. So what I usually do as a practitioner is I delete this first page from my package. I use this as the first page. And then all of that data and information you saw before is listed there for you. Just the definitions of displacement pressure, displacement rate, recommended response of restorative communities, strengthening systems, and light touch density, all things which you've heard today. The neighbors report, the displacement rate map, which shows the larger picture and explains it to a community. The Good Neighbors Index rating by Continuum for explanation. Then how does your COC compare to other COCs? So it'll highlight your COC. It gives you the information for that year. So again, you can see here's 2022, population of the COC, point in time count of the COC, displacement pressure and displacement rate, all mapped. Now, of course, in the PDF, they are not live anymore, but I find that this is a very useful report, and so have others as they keep asking for it. Here's your history from 2012 to 2022. We asked two prevailing questions at this point. How low do you want your displacement rate to be, and what has to be true to achieve that goal? So we tend to ask questions like, are you comfortable? It's interesting to me how many times someone will say, well, I'm not comfortable with that data. And I said, well, are you comfortable with your experience? And they're like, we're not comfortable with experience. And I said, that's why you're uncomfortable with your data. Is that the data is that which is taken from multiple sources that cities and counties and COCs report, is taken from the national census data, the CBSA, the employment data. It is the data. And if we're not enjoying the experience, sometimes we have to determine what do we want to change. And this is a good place to pause with policymakers to talk about where would we like to be and how would we like to experience things differently. As Ed mentioned before, this is a place that you can have comparisons. And as I mentioned, as I was doing the tool, if you don't like this chart, say it's too heavy, it's too busy, you want to compare others, then just go back into the tool, compare it, change who you want to, download what you want in that PowerPoint, put that image over this one, and this report becomes completely customizable. But for 2 minutes, for a 2-minute report, this report works out quite well. Here's displacement rent versus pressure by COC in California. Again, it's showing, it's what amount of pressure. Now, here's the sad truth. If you're a practitioner, we now put green as if someone's spending 40% of their income. You know that even 7 to 10 years ago, we wouldn't have gone green over 33%. But when we look at what it is nationally, it is just the reality of how people are living now and the percentage of the ratio. And that's why you have so many doubled up. You have families that are full families that are doubled up, people living in garages, basements, and other things in order to make things work. We then do the point in time count with those data sets that we showed you before, first time homelessness count, median time, average time of days in shelter, percentage of reports. Again, these reports do not include the comparisons, but what I find when someone wants a comprehensive report with comparisons, I start with this report and then I complement it by downloading the comparison reports by going through that tool. And the way that that tool works is once you go through and you get your comparison reports, don't hit refresh. Don't hit the refresh button when you're making your comparison reports. Make every report you have that you want in that full tool set, including comparisons, then hit that download button and it'll give it to you all in a very nice PowerPoint. Then you can manipulate the way that you want to. But those reports become complementary to a report like this. People who are returning, and then finally, the Good Neighbor Solution Guide. So first, we encourage people to invite friends, stakeholders to review the Good Neighbors Index report. If you want to cause a stir in your community, create a report like this and have a party and say, let's look at our data. Ed Pinto did that for us this past week in Fort Myers, Florida. Very effective for policymakers. He creates the space. I know that Tobias and Arthur have done the same thing around the country. They create the space for us as practitioners to speak into it after, but they've been very helpful to do that. Second, strengthen the systems designed to rapidly reduce displacement. Is work on prevention, diversion, outreach. The best method to reducing those who experience displacement is helping them stay housed, and that's often the most financially effective, affordable space to do that. So we encourage that to be the solution. Third, advocate for light touch density to create naturally affordable, inclusionary, abundant housing options. through auxiliary dwelling units, micro apartments, market income designed homes that allow rehousing. Saw a beautiful example in California the other day of new neighborhoods that are actually doing ADUs for new built homes. You can do the ADU on the side of the house or in the basement of the house, but people are designing solutions, and there's ways to advocate for that, even as those who typically work in the home service sector, to advocate for that because that allows for better solutions. Fourth and finally, and maybe the most fun, practice forecasting the Good Neighbors Index. We do not expect at this time that AEI will be doing a full forecast tool, but we will give you 4 sites for forecasting. But that final forecasting should often be a local conversation. So we will give you 4 sites that you can use for forecasting and then see how close you are. And the good news is in many of our communities, we really only have that advocacy point once a year in January, February, when our point in time report comes out. But let me encourage you, sign up for the AEI Housing Forecast reports. They put them out every month. And if you watch your community and you go into that report, you can see how housing pressure is changing, and that will give you a foresight of what's happening. You can go into the tool and say, here's our concerns, and this is how we need to behave. And so that's a report of what it looks like for LA. Here's one for Costa or Richmond, California, the same thing. You can see it has their data, their point in time count. It's the same report, but it becomes standard. Here's one for Denver. Here's their report. You can see each one's customizable. And then for Salvation Army people, or if you're associated with Salvation Army people, we have a full package that puts that data report in there, which makes it essentially a working case statement for communities. And we're looking at how we can do that more for more partners so that it automatically prints into a case statement that allows you to make influence with policymakers. And so that's the Good Neighbors Index as a tool. That's what the reporting structure looks like. Let me pause for AEI or AEI partners. Again, I commend them to you very sincerely with deep appreciation. They have increased my understanding of housing pressure to housing displacement, a conversation that we didn't even have last year. We knew it to be true, but it's anecdotal. It was a sense, but they have not only researched it, they've proven it. They've created a new language around it, new tools for it, and it's my privilege just to be a small part of taking that information and making it available to people like yourselves today. And so, no, it's a sincere privilege of mine to be part of this conversation with you today. And I will pause and ask our AEI friends to speak into this conversation.
Thank you, Ethan, for that tour de force on Good Neighbor Index. Thank you for all your contributions as the catalyst. This would not have been done without your assistance and insight and tutelage on getting this done. We did a lot of the analysis, but you really came up with challenging us to make these connections. Which we're happy to do. We view ourselves as a source for independent, objective, nonpartisan research. We don't have an agenda. All we have is we look at the data, we look at the information that comes out of that, and what conclusions can you reach in terms of new knowledge, which we think we've presented a lot here, and then what does that mean for policy solutions. But we're always following the data, where the data leads us, and that's our goal. All of this is provided free. There's no charge for any of this, and we will continue to do that. AEI is a nonprofit, just puts information out on the public green. That's why we have all these 2 toolkits with all of these total of about over 35 tools between them. We'll be adding more. And that's our goal, is to provide this information for people all across the country to use, because that's where we think this change has to happen, is all across the country. It can't be led by Washington, D.C. It has to be led at the state and local level, it has to be led at the community level, and that's our goal. So I will also, since Ethan attributed the KISS rule to me, I will attribute to Ethan where I learned the plural of anecdote is not data. And as you can see, we try not to use anecdotes. We try to use the data and figure out how to make the data speak information and then knowledge. So with that, I thank everyone for their participation. We don't have any questions. I know this has been a grueling 2 hours, but we wanted to go through it from stem to stern as we did this morning. If you have any questions, you have our email contacts, and please contact us with any questions. Happy to respond to any questions you might have. With that, we are ready to end this webinar. Thank you all for your participation.
Yes, thank you very much. I see on the attendee list people who've spoken into this for many years with us. So thank you for attending today. And Ed, one more time, thank you for your leadership and compassion across the country to make sure that we're all good neighbors and that everyone has a place to sleep tonight. Thank you.